Professor R.S. Sarraju, Auroville Foundation Governing Board member, together in conversation on the topic of Resurgent India.
Sadhak Mitro. So day before yesterday, I met our Secretary Jayanti Ravi in her office. She was preparing the speakers list. At that time, she said that along with Sraddhalu ji, please sit and have a conversation and give a brief talk, so that I am here. So the topic is Resurgence of India. I told Sraddhalu ji I'll talk in English as well as Hindi also, because I used to speak in Hindi. He said it's okay. So I'll try to speak as far as possible in English, and in between, if necessary, I'll try to talk in Hindi also. So today we are celebrating Global Spirituality Mahotsav. And in this Mahotsav, we are talking about Punrutthan. And let us start with the basic concept, what Aurobindo says about Resurgent India. So there are 5 points in the concept of Resurgent India. So what Aurobindo visualizes in his dream, as our Reddy Sahab was telling initially, the 5th dream is having all the 4 dreams inside it. And in this Resurgent India, there are 5 points. The first one is spiritually awakened civilization. Spiritually awakened civilization. The second one, so about freedom. It should regain freedom. And third one is revives its culture. So culture should be revived. And the fourth one is integrate modern knowledge. And fifth one is guides the world towards the higher consciousness. This is the ultimate. When the world is raised with higher consciousness, all the boundaries will vanish and we can go ahead with the unity, spiritual unity. So then, what is the perspective towards the Indian resurgence of India? So the vision of resurgent India in the thought of Aurobindo is deeply spiritual, as we all know. And along with spirituality, it is cultural as well as civilizational. And he doesn't see India's revival as merely political independence from colonial rule. So several people see it as independence from colonial rule, but he doesn't. But profound awakening of its soul and its role in future humanity is very important from his point of view. And then, what are the core ideas of Aurobindo on resurgent India? The first idea is spiritual nationalism. So people talk about nationalism, but he talks about spiritual nationalism. So Aurobindo did not believe in geographical nation, as we all know. So along with this, he was visualizing a Shakti in living geographical and as a spiritual force. Shakti as a spiritual force, this is also one of the important factors. And Indians' true identity is lying in Sanatan Dharma. So this is the third important factor which he underlines. And nationalism फ्रॉम एक धार्मिक होता है, सेक्रेड, तो फ्रॉम दिस पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ही इज प्रेजेंटिंग द थिंग. So political freedom is a necessity, because we cannot express until unless we are not politically free. So for expression's sake, he is going for the concept of state. And then Sanskritic Renaissance or Punajjagaran or Punarutthan, this is the important factor for him. So in his, there is one essay, the Renaissance of India or Indian. So इसमें it's classical knowledge systems. Renaissance कहाँ चाहिए? Where do we need this Renaissance? He says it's classical knowledge systems चाहिए. So even now we are in NEP 2020 discussing about the Indian knowledge systems to be incorporated in all subjects where we teach at the school level or college level or university level. The second thing is philosophical traditions. So we have to understand the philosophical traditions in its real way, in truth. As in our earlier session, we have discussed arts, education, literature. These are also important things. Then Aurobindo never supported blind revisionism or revivalism. So he proposed assimilate modern Western science and rationality, but preservance of Indian spiritual foundations is very important. So he was realizing a future India, future world, so not with only intellectual perspective, with a spiritual perspective. For that, so he was talking about evolution of consciousness. His central philosophical idea was humanity is evolving spiritually. So अभी मानवता जो है विकास के क्रम में है, तो इसको दृष्टि में रखकर उन्होंने बात की. सो अब भारत को इस क्रम में क्या करना चाहिए? व्हाट शुड इंडिया डू इन दिस प्रोसेस? व्हाट इज द रोल? सो इंडिया हैज़ टू guide the evolution. That is the role of India, which he said. So how it will happen? Through yogic knowledge is one of the important point he brought forward. And resurgent India would not dominate politically or otherwise. So it will illuminate spirituality among humanity, so that so equality or whatever we are thinking, it will be there in humanity. For this, he was envisaging national education. So education rooted in, the first thing is Indian languages and culture. So he promotes all Indian languages along with the culture. And then character building, that what we call Vyaktitva Nirman. Third one is integral development. So India's insurgence is for welfare of the world. So एक राष्ट्र के लिए नहीं, not for one country or not for one religion. It's for the world. And this is not to show one against another. This is for unity. Several times we find one against another. एक के खिलाफ एक दूसरे को खड़ा करने की जो एक लंबी परंपरा हमें दिखाई देती है. इट्स नॉट लाइक दैट. सो ही क्वेश्चनड several colonial notions. So when he was studying, again he questioned, is India civilized? जो भारत की नागरिकता को लेकर जो प्रश्न किए जा रहे थे, उनको लेकर उन्होंने बहुत अच्छा बात हुई है. So he was redefining civilization. So in terms of spiritualism and spirituality. And again, अरबिंदो जी के जो ट्रू सिविलाइजेशन क्या होता है, जो कैसी संस्कृति है, क्योंकि वर्तमान में हम इन प्रेजेंट वी आर डिस्कसिंग अबाउट सिविल सोसाइटीज, स्मार्ट cities in the 21st century, so many things. As such, what is true civilization? A civilization with a spiritual knowledge, a philosophical approach, philosophical outlook, and ethical culture. This is very important. Nowadays in our education system we are talking about ethical culture and inner development, antarik vikas. These are 4 factors. And then India is a power and India is a mother. This is the concept. भारत माता के रूप में भारत को देखते हैं अरविंदो जी, तो ये आज भी हमारे लिए बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात बन जाती है. तो स्पिरिचुअल डेप्थ, फिलॉसफी एंड कल्चरल कंटिन्यूटी. Again, this continuity is very important. So we are following the continuity from Vedic age to till today, and there are few reforms, so revisiting certain things, but this continuity is very important for us. तो यहाँ अरबिंदो जी वर्तमान में क्या करना चाहते हैं, तो हम सब जानते हैं. तो वर्तमान मानवता के ढांचे के भीतर तो सामाजिक चीज़ें हैं, इनमें हस्तक्षेप नहीं करना चाहते. मानवता में जो चेतना है, तो पूरी चेतना का उन्नयन चाहते हैं. तो दिस इज इम्पॉर्टेंट. सो वे बोलते हैं कि मैं एक उच्चतर सत्य की तलाश में हूँ. प्रश्न यह नहीं है कि वह सत्य मनुष्य को ज़्यादा बड़ा बनाता है या नहीं. प्रश्न यह है कि क्या वह लोगों को सत्य, शांति और प्रकाश में निवास प्रदान करके अज्ञात, अनृत और कष्ट और कलह भरे जीवन से दूर रखें. तो आजकल हर जगह ये जो कलह है, तो जहाँ आनंद नहीं है, तो इस कलह को दूर रखें. आनंदपूर्ण और शांतिपूर्ण, पीसफुल एंड हैप्पी लाइफ तो उन्होंने प्रमोट किया था. तो ये इसके लिए उन्होंने कर्म, भक्ति, ज्ञान और आत्मपूर्णता का मार्ग हमें दिखाया है, based on which we are going ahead. And for this तो ये योग का जो मार्ग इन्होंने बताया, अतिमानस का जो मार्ग बताया, तो इसके बल पर इन्होंने अल्टीमेटली डिवाइन लाइफ, दिव्य जीवन का संदेश दिया था. तो दिव्य जीवन के प्रति तो जो भी तो हमारे कदम हैं, तो आगे बढ़ने के लिए उन्होंने प्रेरणा दी. तो अपनी बात यही मैं समाप्त करते हुए, तो हम वर्तमान समय में सामाजिक समरसता चाहते हैं, प्रकृति के साथ मिलकर जीना चाहते हैं, पर्यावरण संरक्षण करना चाहते हैं, आत्मनिर्भर भारत बनाना चाहते हैं, स्वदेशी चाहते हैं और नागरिक के कर्तव्यों को नैतिकता के साथ अपने आप निभाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, इस ओर जाना चाहते हैं. तो परिवार में स्नेह, मित्रता की दृष्टि से परिवार का निर्माण करना चाहते हैं, राष्ट्र का निर्माण करना चाहते हैं, विश्व का निर्माण करना चाहते हैं. तो इस दृष्टि से अरविंदो का जीवन दर्शन हमें पथ प्रदर्शन करता है. तो अभी मैं अपनी बात यहाँ समाप्त करते हुए श्रद्धालु जी से अनुरोध करता हूँ कि आगे बात बढ़ाएं. तो उनकी बात के बाद फिर हम परिचर्चा शुरू करें.
When we consider the theme of Resurgent India, implicit to the title are two ideas. A resurgence means there was a fall, but it also means there was a rise before from which there was a fall, from which there is a resurgence. And the question we should ask, therefore, what was the cause of the fall? That we do not repeat the same error and the resurgence should not lead to another fall. We should also ask ourselves what was the cause of the earlier rise, which may still be relevant and maybe even essential for the new rise. So before we can speak of the future of the resurgence, we need to take a look at the past to understand what were the strengths in the prior rise, what were the flaws that led to the fall, and what is their relevance in today's circumstances, which may be very different. Shri Aurobindo alone gives us that kind of a large perspective across human history, going back into that time which today is called prehistory. Because it goes back all the way to the Vedic age, of which the ending is 8,000 years ago. And that's only the ending of it. That's all that we remember. And from there we see not only a grand, great, gigantic efflorescence of the civilization in India, but we see also, as far as we are able to observe trends, literature, as well as archaeological evidence, we see this space of growth in India as inspiring and even leading growth elsewhere, setting standards elsewhere. In the earliest Greek writings and traditions, there are references to India as the land of knowledge, as the land of wealth. When Alexander the Great chooses to conquer the world, he does not start by conquering his space. He goes to the hub of power and the hub of wealth in the world, which is India. Until he can conquer India, he cannot conquer the world. If he conquers India, then he can conquer the world. We see this also at the time of the British Empire. The British were traders. They began trade in India, through trade grew, and as their control of India's wealth and power grew, they grew proportionally in wealth and power over the whole world. The entire British Empire, on which the sun never sets across the earth globe, was sustained as long as they ruled India. From the moment they lost India, the entire empire collapsed. So when we look back at the past, we see a consistent pattern of great wealth, great power that follows inevitably, but also a center of enormous innovation and exploration and thought and technology. All of these Shri Aurobindo makes allusion to when he describes the characteristics of the Indian civilization as a space not only which had a tremendous vitality to explore every possibility, fearing nothing, including in the spiritual domains, fearing nothing to explore even dangerously contradictory spiritual experiences. But at the same time, there is this tremendous intellectual power upon which this exploration is based and which leads to material masteries, including technological masteries, the likes of which even today we are unable to replicate. And a very simple example would be what you see in the iron pillar of Delhi, which to all best testing is ordinary iron but does not rust across hundreds of years. And that is only one of 200 such centers of which we know nothing about, because our educational textbooks do not speak a word of the achievements of the past, even of our technological achievements. So really, when you look back all the way, you must go all the way back to the Vedas, which are the inspiration and the foundation of the civilization, but you must also see how it has inspired the civilization. What are the imprints that the Veda infuses? And then what is the missing element which leads to the loss or the collapse? We may, for argument's sake, say, all right, any great civilization must follow by a collapse because there will be a need, perhaps there is an exhaustion of its effort. But it's not so simple. Because we do see in India a continuity of civilization. We do see, unlike any other past old ancient civilizations, we still have that continuity. When you open a textbook of history today, anywhere in the world, they will speak of ancient civilizations, and all the names they give you, Mesopotamia or Sumeria or Egypt or Aztec or others, all of them have died. They do not even know their original language. They have nothing of their original tradition still surviving. India alone retains the full continuity of the language, full continuity of its literature, its spiritual values and experiences and traditions, although enormously diversified and enriched in so many different lineages and traditions, necessarily, of course, given the time factor involved, but also the need for multiplicity and full richness of possible explorations. India alone survives in continuity, and despite what we may say when we speak of resurgence, that implicit is a fall, during the fall, India still demonstrates great wealth, great strength, as recently as 200 years ago. And it's interesting to study, we will not go into that though, it's interesting to study how, according to British records, India was still producing 25% of global industrial output 200 years ago to the day. And that's enormous. A single city of Surat in India was producing more textiles for export alone than the 3 largest companies in the whole of Europe were producing. And the quality of textile was so much superior that in the Roman times, they had to put a ban on import of Indian goods because the treasury was being drained. And so there is an emergency call which is made where the triumvirate which rules Rome calls for an emergency meeting and says, we're draining our treasury because everyone's buying products from India. Put a halt to this. When the land routes to Europe were cut off because of wars, there is an emergency meeting in France of the King of France who says Indian textiles are not coming through in the supplies, so he bans the normal people from buying Indian textiles so that it may be reserved for the royalty alone. You go back barely 1850 about, and you will find there is an exhibition in Paris of India's gold products, jewelry. And the exhibition, according to then newspapers and documentation, the exhibition shocks Europe. Because the question that is asked is, how can human hands make such fine, precise, beautiful patterns of this detail? And the next question is, how can we replicate this using machines? Because that's the industrial age beginning. That's the kind of impact India still has barely 200 years ago. And the ending of that impact is when the British take over India and destroy and sink its industries. India at that point has the world's largest shipbuilding industry. And the British in 1909 pass an order that you cannot build new ships without permission, and then they stop giving permission. That's the normal bureaucratic strategy to strangle any economy. Have you seen that subsequently also? You see that happening all over the world even now? The same pattern being replicated. And that's how India's largest shipbuilding industry sank to zero, and the same space which was building the ships became the world's largest ship-breaking industry, which exists to this day, both on the east coast near Orissa as well as west coast near Gujarat. So this is, and up to 1895, India was the world's largest producer of diamonds and gold. And it was the only producer of diamonds until the British discovered mines in South Africa, which then replaced India's mines. But this is to say that despite all the decline that we may speak of, we must recognize, despite the decline, India held the highest position in wealth, in power, in innovation, in literature, in the arts, in the sciences and technologies. Even in its fall, even in its lowest of the fall, even in the worst of invasions and colonial rule. And the actual loss into extreme poverty takes place only in the last 200 years about, when the British sink deliberately all the industries and shut it down, provoke a series of famines by taking away grain from the farmers who produce them, and for a period of 50 years, 1850 to about 1900 so, there are a series of famines where, according to British records, 10% of India's population dies of starvation. Now you must understand what that means. In a joint family, let's say of 10 people, one person dies of starvation. What happens to the other 9? Do you think they're healthy? They're on the brink of death equally because they're sharing food. If one dies, then the other 9 are on the brink. And if that lasts for 3 generations, what does that do to a civilization morally? And then physically. The result is some of the wealthiest become the poorest, and according to one of the British records then, when the viceroy writes to the king, says, the plains of India are littered with the bones of the weavers, the potters, and all the other, what today we call industries. That's what led to the final collapse, at which point India was basically begging for survival. All that is in the last 200 years. Look back at the 8,000 years and you see the consistency despite the rise and the fall, even in the worst of the fall. So still we have to ask this question, what makes for that strength and resilience? What makes for the rise? And most important, what made for the fall? Shri Aurobindo obviously gives you this very direct and simple answer, but he also elaborates. And the kind of elaboration he offers spread across several hundred pages is so detailed as to boggle even the common mind, and especially the typical, I will say, I will use this word, typical scholar. The typical scholar has been brought up in a westernized worldview, where pretty much the world begins about 4000 BC, and we were all monkeys at that point, and somehow we have grown into civilization in the last few hundred years, when Europe basically got rid of religion and became enlightened. That's the vocabulary, generally. But in that limited worldview, very little is really understood, and particularly the context of India's civilization growth is completely beyond its reach and scope. And this is the reason why we have to step out of that worldview to really appreciate India. So I come now to Shri Aurobindo's presentation about this, but in a very key idea that the roots of Indian civilization are spiritual. And because spiritual in this case is not an ascetic spirituality, it is an affirmative spirituality, the spirituality nourishes life, inspires life, strengthens life, directs the development and unfoldment and an evolutionary development of life. The fall, in proportion, is because of the withdrawal from this spirituality, and particularly in an ascetic withdrawal in which life is abandoned. And these are first two key ideas. We will see a few more things as we go along. But the character of India's spirituality needs to be understood in this sense, that it is the spring, the wellspring of life itself. And in this context, we look at the framework of the Veda, where all begins, all originates in the oneness of spirit. And it is spirit which progressively unfolds in as if layers or degrees of self-expression, self-modification, all the way down to the most material. And thus, from the Vedic perspective, the world and the material world is essentially spiritual. It is a concealed spirituality. All is Satchidananda, or even an expression of the form and play of Satchidananda, but concealed behind a phenomenal appearance. And therefore, the purpose of life literally becomes to discover that which is concealed. And so, India's spirituality is one of discovering the concealed Satchidananda and expressing it more and more completely until it begins to become a true and complete expression of the original Satchidananda. The Vedas remind us that we are children of that immortality. Amritasya putraha. The Amritam, the immortality, is the Satchidananda of which we are children. In our soul, in our essence, we still live in that. We are that. But we too, in our incarnation, have encased ourselves in this materiality in which the spirituality is concealed. And so not only an external discovery, but an internal discovery is essential. And between the two, there is a natural relationship. As the internal discovery unfolds, the external discovery inevitably must follow. Or putting it another way, the external discovery cannot be completed unless there is an equivalent internal discovery. So in practice, there will be a double discovery process, a double evolutionary process, which is led by the spirit already hidden within. Because it is that which flowers out, it is that which can lead and also reveal itself. So the entire perspective of what drives life, what is the wellspring of our motivation, changes completely. We are not desire-based driven essentially, we are soul-based driven. Except that we are not conscious of the soul drive. We are more conscious of the desire drive. But concealed behind the desire is the soul drive. And to the extent we are able to align even the desire drives to the soul drives, we can draw upon a tremendous power. The same power that builds the universes is seated within us. And the same freedom that is at the root of the whole universe's diversity is seated within us and can sustain the full diversity of life experience. It alone can unite the most extremes of diversity. And this becomes then the basis of the civilization's tremendous power and capacity to play with all possibilities fearlessly. Because everything is possible. Everything can be held in souls, in self. And in the most extreme of diversity, there is not the fragmentation of the civilization. All is possible. All is acceptable. All can be held under that oneness. This is what characterizes the spirituality of India across these ages. But there comes one more thing. If the unfoldment has to be complete, it must touch all the gradations through which spirit expresses itself, even within us. So it must include mastery of mind and intellect and intelligence. It must include the full power of life force and its energies and its adventure and exploration, and it must include equally the mastery of matter. If you neglect any of these, you have constrained, limited, or even deformed the full expression of spirit. And so when a civilization takes this as its goal, there is no limit to what it can do. And it is this which is at the basis of the efflorescence and the mastery of the Indian civilization. Take any activity of life and you will find it roots itself in spirit, generally with reference to the Veda, but roots itself in self and unfolds all the way to mastering all the domains. I will take one example, and only maybe two. One first example is in the domain of martial arts, where normally, as you will see even in the best of martial arts, the whole focus is on physical and the vital energies. But if you look at the training of the martial arts in India, it roots itself in spirit. Even the space in which the martial arts are taught, there is the center which is God, and the powers of God which are the instruments that you must master. And it begins with self-mastery of mind, of thought, which must then guide life force, which must be so well mastered that life energy itself can be launched in a single powerful projection for a direct impact of life force without even material mastery. And then from there comes the material mastery and skill of weapons. The degree to which that mastery can be taken is, in principle, limitless. We have extraordinary stories, and the civilization is full of such stories in every field, where even with the skill of a whip, and this is from the story of the Kerala Kalari Payut mastery, this, I believe it is Tacholi Othenan, he takes this whip and he whips it around. And there's the whole army of the king in front of him, and he says to the king, "Go back now, otherwise you will all die." Here's one man with a whip. And the king says, "I don't believe you." So he takes the tip of the whip, dips it in paint, and whips around in a few moments. Every single soldier in front has a white mark on the tip, on the neck. And he says, "On the tip of my whip is a blade. Instead of the paint, if it was a blade, all your soldiers would be dead." Here's a mastery which goes so far that, and there are people who do this. Another example, which again within the martial arts, is where you are taught this technology by which you can concentrate on a person and render them unconscious, cloud their mind, redirect their thoughts. That's the perfect mastery in a warfare, isn't it? Where you can actually conceal, prevent them from seeing you, or direct their thoughts elsewhere. And so Marma Vidya is one of the techniques which is taught. These still exist today. There are masters who have these abilities. But what was at that time 108 schools of the martial arts just from the Kalari system is today reduced to barely 12. And of those barely 12, I would say 6 or 7 are surviving. And just to give a glimpse of one space, or you go into the space of music, where the whole goal of music is to manifest a spiritual experience, transmit it not only in the musician, but into the people. And in that, the power of this in mastering matter, not merely in a psychological or spiritual state, in mastering matter comes when in the Deepa Raga, the Raga of the lamp, you place before you an unlit lamp, And as you enter the full intensity of the Deepa Raga, the heat concentrated in the lamp causes it to spontaneously catch fire. I'm giving this as an example to show that unless that spiritual mastery is brought all the way down to matter, it is not considered a spiritual mastery. And it is this which made the civilization masterful in the material space. Some of the most extraordinary, beautiful temples even are the consequence of this, the beautiful idols, carvings, and all the other material sciences, including material technologies, including, as we find in the Mahabharata, in the Ramayana, flying machines. And it is controversial because it does not fit the Western paradigm where we were supposed to be barbarians at that time. You have a text in the 7th century AD where you have the description in Samarangana Sutradhara, which is a text of warfare. 32nd chapter is machines of warfare, in which you have machines described which are equivalent of modern tanks. It's called an elephant machine where people are seated inside a metal encasing. But the rest you can add, the details are not important. And there are 4 verses dedicated to flying machines for the purpose of warfare. And there the technique taught is mercury, which is put in cylinders, and a fire which is set under to release the concealed power of mercury to make the Vimana fly in the air. Now this is 7th century AD. You don't invent such stories. This is part of a tradition which existed going back so many thousand years. The Mahabharata, for example, dated purely with astronomical markings, goes back to about 3100 BC. At that time, you have flying machines again described. Entire texts which describe these things. So it does not fit the modern context, and people today, unfortunately in India, are embarrassed to speak about it because it is not fitting into Western science model. We need to free ourselves from those hang-ups and face the reality for what it is and actually begin to explore these technologies in the spirit in which our ancients did. But all this is only to demonstrate the roots and the consequences of the spiritual foundations of Indian civilization, the key idea, what was meant by spirituality. This must be corrected because that's not what we mean by spirituality today. We use the word spiritual, we mean something totally different. So this is the first important thing we need to draw from the past. The second important thing, which is I will point to as cause of decline. And Shri Aurobindo speaks of this. You have to really go deep into the various elements in the analysis that he offers you. But the key idea comes with the withdrawal of spirituality into an otherworldly spirituality and not a life-affirming spirituality. This begins with Buddhism. In the Buddhist experience, or in the Buddhist objective, let's say, the goal of the Buddha was to find the shortest way out of suffering. And the shortest way is not to outgrow suffering and rediscover the underlying Satchidananda. The shortest way is to get out of it. And so the shortest way getting out means getting out of life. And subsequent to that, a series of corrective steps take place. You have, of course, Adi Shankaracharya, who comes, literally, Shri Aurobindo's phrase, storms all over India to drive out Buddhism because it disconnects from the roots of the civilization. But he brings in its place the return of the Satchidananda, but with one caveat. Because in the process of defeating Buddhism, Shri Aurobindo says he becomes half a Buddhist. He must accept the premise that the world is a domain of suffering, but he corrects it by saying the world is illusory, and so the suffering is illusory. Find the Satchidananda, but again beyond the world. Subsequently, you have Ramanujacharya and others who come with reaffirmation of life, but what they bring is not strong enough to override those earlier experiences which remain strong with their ascetic turn. And with that begins the decline of Indian civilization. Shri Aurobindo's observation, when the best minds turn away from life, life necessarily must begin to wither. And he says the last phase of India's creative dynamism we see about, let's say, 1000 AD or so, approximately that period. We still see an efflorescence of culture and art and technologies, but then after that begin the invasions. And the invasions are possible because precisely strength has been withdrawn. Life has been discarded. Remember in the way it's articulated today, power corrupts, wealth corrupts. So discard these, and all ascetic traditions shun power, shun wealth. This is so deeply rooted even in India today that you will see during the freedom struggle, Mahatma Gandhi promotes weakness and poverty as spiritual. And this is absolutely a perversion of spirituality. On the one side, we find traditionally you worship Mahakali, you worship Mahalakshmi as strength and wealth. And on the other side, you're being taught it's good to be weak, it's good to be strong, that is spirituality. So if somebody is wealthy and strong, he is not spiritual by definition. And so the moment India turns to that kind of spirituality, the consequence, of course, you get completely, wiped out literally. You see this happening, you must understand, India of today is not the whole of India, culturally or spiritually. The whole of India, culturally and spiritually, extends all the way to the border of Afghanistan. And it is even in the Mahabharata, you see, it is from the Afghan princess who is married, and from there begins then Shakuni, who is her brother, who brings all the troubles. And that's from Kandahar of today. And in Afghanistan was a huge center of Hindu and Buddhist learning. Huge center of which nothing remains today. What happened to them? Except the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were also destroyed recently. What happened today to them? No trace, no memory in that whole space. Do you know what happened? You find the clue in the naming of the mountains in Afghanistan. Do you know what they are called? Hindu Kush. Why would Taliban, which hates Buddhism and Hinduism, still name their mountains Hindu Kush? Because the word Kush means massacre. They proudly name their mountains massacre of the Hindus. And so that entire region was characterized by the massacre of the Hindus and the Buddhists, completely wiped out, no trace left. Why? They had become pacifist and weak in their spirituality. The definition of spirituality meant no strength, no force even to defend yourself, even to defend knowledge. And the result was a complete wipeout. And it was only when the invasions enter India and the shock of the invasion which wakes up the Kshatriya spirit, the power and strength, and you are kicked into waking up to fight back simply to survive. And Sri Aurobindo observes, if not for those invasions, India would have easily become a nation of monks. So you understand the reason for the decline generally and the consequent period of colonization which ensues as a consequence of turning away from the true spirituality of the Veda and accepting weakness and poverty as spiritual, or even defining it in such terms. But there's something more serious. Why did this happen? How could the Vedic spirituality get turned into this perversion of spirituality? Where was the weak point that the breakthrough took place? You cannot say, well, Buddhism did it. Buddhism itself could not find a solution which was aligned to the Vedic because of a flaw. And now we come to the crux of the point. And the crux, Sri Aurobindo says, is in the Vedic experience, in the divinization, in the vocabulary we will use of the Vijnanam, the Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, which is the supermind of Sri Aurobindo, that the Vedic rishis experienced, they infused and embodied that in the mind, in the life energies, but the physical body itself was left merely as a support for the spiritual and psychological transformation. The physical body was not included in the transformation. The result was a fine gap. That fine gap, which is a limitation in the Vedic experience, once it faces the stress of life, eventually that fine gap begins to become a split. Matter, body itself at some point is unable to be transformed, unable to be spiritualized, and becomes then the root cause of the suffering, and the abandonment of the body, abandonment of the matter, and abandonment of material world become the consequence eventually. This very fine, thin gap becomes then the cause of a gigantic split that distorts completely the spiritual ideal. The correction, we find Sri Aurobindo bringing back the original idea of the Vedic inspiration and the transformation and divinization of life and taking it all the way to the physical transformation. The body itself must become conscious of the spirit, must incarnate spirit and be transformed in terms of the spirit. The limitation of that fine limitation of the Vedic experience is now corrected and must become the basis for the new resurgence, without which you will have the tendency to fall back into the old patterns. How do we undo these centuries of distortion of even the idea of spirituality? That's the challenge. And in the way things have unfolded so far, not because of us, despite us, the younger generations turned away from spirit. Or more truly, they turned away from ascetic spirituality, turned to the West for its example of material strength and wealth. So Shri Aurobindo points to the last 300 years particularly, where in the East you had the spiritual denying or neglecting matter. In the West you had matter denying or neglecting spirit. And the final reconciliation of these two is forced as if by a clash of civilizational values of East and West. And so among the younger generations, you saw this turning away, an abandonment of Indic values, turning to the West, repeating, replicating, and failing generally because it does not work finally. But in the process, as if integrating within themselves what was missing, and rediscovering by an indirect route the place of matter and perfection of life, and then attempting to reconnect with the spirit. But it doesn't happen because your spirituality just told you to abandon the world. So there's a disjoint there, a gap. And that's the struggle you see today in India. There was a reference earlier you made to India's freedom and Shri Aurobindo's comment of India's freedom. And one of the points which I've always insisted is when India became politically free, 1947, it was purely a political freedom. At that point, we had not yet recovered our economic freedom, our cultural freedom, our intellectual freedom, and the spiritual freedom. And it is this which I mean by the spiritual freedom, the ability to, or the rediscovering of the true spirituality of the civilization, shorn of the distortions which have come in between. But there is an equivalent requirement before we can even come to that fully of rediscovering the cultural freedom, intellectual freedom, and economic freedom. The first signs of this we have, I will say, in the last 10 years. And before that, all those who ruled India ruled with a mindset which was still a remnant of the colonized mind. The first Prime Minister of India stated in so many words, Jawaharlal Nehru said, "I am the last Englishman to rule India." He saw himself as an Englishman, he saw his role as one of ruling India, not serving India, and he had nothing of the roots of the Indian civilizational values. Therefore, everything that he enforced structurally in India, both in governance systems, in educational systems, in business and organization of industry, everything was a bad imitation of mostly Soviet communism, but also bad imitation of Western ideas of what India's civilization represented. Even his idea of India's civilization in what is called Discovery of India is so crude and immature. I'm sorry, these are harsh words, but it's real, you have to face it. It had no understanding of these deeper ranges or the well springs of Indian spirituality. And the result was we wasted a few decades in a bad imitation. It's not as if this was unseen. Shri Aurobindo wrote in 1910, "It is becoming increasingly clear that India will pass through the experiment of parliamentary democracy simply to realize that it is not suited for us." How much more direct can you get? Pass through that experiment. How many decades do we have to suffer through that experiment? And today we are beginning to question, this has not worked, what can we do? An attempt to rebuild systems has begun. The mother foresees the future and tries to bring forward those systems which belong to the future already here in the present. And the space in which she builds this is Auroville. So you have here a past which is hanging on, which does not belong in the existing systems. You have a future which is being embodied, which is still too far ahead of our current consciousness because we must be frank, we have not made the necessary shift in consciousness to live by those values. We're supposed to be doing that. Where we have failed, we have chaos. Where we make the effort, we are able to embody something of that. So we're kind of an in-between limbo. And the only way we can cut through this, make this transition, bridge this, is by this deeper understanding of India's spiritual roots and the sense of the spirituality and the means by which this spirituality can be realized. It means, as a first correction, to recognize the world itself as the body of God. Sarvam khalu idam Brahman. All this verily is the divine consciousness in its oneness. This is Sachidananda, concealed, yes. Starting with this. And then what is the next consequence? Making the effort now to discover yourself as well as the concealed delight and the knowledge and the power in circumstances. And then you become, so to say, scientists, discoverers in whatever field you take. If it is through music, it will be thus. If it is to technology, material technology, it will be thus. If it is through administration, it will be thus. But all these will as if unfold naturally from this base of correction. And when we create new systems, Shri Aurobindo also makes this comment. So he's asked, well, if parliamentary democracy is not suited for us, what is suited? The response he gives, India's mind wants to choose its king first. So you vote for one person that you trust. You don't vote for a party. You don't vote indirectly as in England. He said that only works in England. It has worked nowhere else. He even makes this comment, the parliamentary system has brought Europe to its sorry pass. You can see the mess that Europe is in increasingly. And so you choose your king, so to say, who chooses his team. So a presidential model. And among presidential models, two variants which the United States and the French systems offer, he preferred the French modification for India. And then he says on the grassroots, a panchayat kind of framework where you have local governance for all local problems. Then he says something which links the two, the upper structure and the lower structure. And then a very interesting observation he says, what you do to link is not so important as long as it is the outcome of the innate Indian thought and genius. So there are things we can do if we start putting our mind to it and work for it, and maybe we make mistakes and when we make corrections as we go along, and that will be part of the resurgence of India. Effectively, we need to rebuild the entire civilization in terms of forms from its spiritual roots. But in doing so, we might just discover that some of the forms which were created in the past are still relevant. But because now we rebuild them from our own innate effort and genius of the values of the civilization, it is now regenerated form. And other forms we might say, yes, that worked then, but it needs to be modified in the context. And you find that context and find that modification. And it is this which will be the sign that India has come into her own and is rebuilding herself step by step across all these different domains. What direction will it take? How far will it go? If the past is any sign of greatness, the future will only be greater. Shri Aurobindo's statement is a promise. He says, we do not belong to the past dawns, but to the noons of the future. And the Vedas he puts as past dawns, meaning the noons will be far greater, far brighter. Yes, it might be a few hundred years from now, doesn't matter. But we are in the cusp of this transition, and those of us who recognize and find the affinity with what Shri Aurobindo teaches us will have the privilege of being pioneers of making this effort. And this effort will not be in your lifetime, will not see success in your lifetime. Those who fought for India's freedom and died for it did not see freedom in their lifetime. But when they came back with that freedom that they had won in their prior efforts. So it will be for us. What effort you make now, do not look for success within this lifetime necessarily. Try for it, strive for it. But if it does not, do not worry. When you come back, you will be sharing in the success of the efforts that you make. This is the perspective you must have. And this is the perspective which made India great. Because you saw the future in terms of so many lifetimes of work to be done still, of which this life is barely one small step. We are taught in the Ayurvedic system that to think of our body as the outcome of 7 generations of efforts of our ancestors. And what you do to your body today in terms of caring for it and building its consciousness and capacities and not destroying it in perversions and vices is what you will transmit for the next 7 generations at least. And that's only in the biology. In consciousness terms, you will reincarnate to continue to receive what you have left behind now. Start thinking in terms of the long term. Start thinking in terms of 7 generations at least. And start thinking in terms of what immediate step we can take despite whatever the problems might be, but without compromise. The greatest problem of modern India has been compromise from the very first step. When India became free, the very first Prime Minister of India was not elected. Did you know that? The first elected Prime Minister of India was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. And then he was asked to step down by Gandhiji. And he changed the structure of electorates so that Nehru would win. And again, Nehru did not win. And that's when he said to Sardar Patel, I have promised Nehru's parents that I will make him Prime Minister, so you step aside, I make him. And he was selected, not elected. That pattern has continued, that pattern of compromise, even in the formation of there was a very important discussion earlier about India's constitution. That was also a compromise. There was no attempt to go back to the roots and rebuild from scratch. The only one we know of is by Vasishtha Ganapati Muni, who wrote India's constitution from a spiritual foundation. Nobody's even bothered to look at that. But it is on the basis of dharma, that the civil constitution itself needs to be recast. But forget the text of constitution, life itself has to be recast. And all this must go into our educational system. Unfortunately, because of Nehru's proclivity to replicating the Soviet model, he brought in the communist mindset into the education and into the media. The result is today a very strong leftist-driven, hard materialistic, anti-spiritual turn rooted in the educational system. The problem is when you start correcting, the prior teachers who have been groomed into that thought are the first point of resistance. How will you make the change? You can say, all right, each generation will make one small change. It does not work. You need a clean break and start fresh. And this begins in small pockets of schools, colleges, universities, which need freedom from the government control to be able to start in their own essential way. Within a larger common shared framework, no problem. This has started happening, but Auroville is one such space. The entire Auroville space is an educational space. The education itself here needs to be shaped in this way. We have an opportunity here for Auroville to become the seed for India's resurgence and global resurgence. Because India's resurgence is not merely for India, it is a spiritual resurgence. It is a resurgence for humanity. And it was this which completes Sri Aurobindo's 5 dreams when he speaks of the world itself receiving from India the gift of spirituality. What does that mean? It means this: living life on spiritual foundations. India has to demonstrate that and share that. Before India can do that as a whole, Auroville, which is a much smaller space and is based around people who have dedicated themselves to a spiritual ideal at least, can begin by not only setting that standard, but seeding the world from this space. And such would be the context I would place for our discussion, the topic, and the meeting taking place in Auroville today.
Sraddhalu ji, so our discussion started from the Vedic period and the concept of resurgence, Punrutthan. So rise and fall. The concept of renaissance is not based on rise and fall. It's a continuity. And you rightly pointed out, since after Vedas, Puranas, prior to Puranas, Upanishads were there, and it is expanded, the philosophy and the knowledge is expanded in Upanishads. And after that, whatever that is there in Upanishads, it is again expanded in Puranas. Again, when it is not understood by the people, it is expanded in Mahakavyas to common people, and then Gita and Mahabharata, so many continuous process has come. Even when the Vijayanagar kings were attacked by Muslims, and Sion has reinterpreted Vedas. When somebody is fighting with you, would you like to sit and read and write, interpret? It's not so. It is to rethink and have a new strategy and add few things more to the continuity and all. So rightly you have pointed out this. But sometimes people question, this is the digital age and we are going towards digitalization and so many problems are cropping up with this. So as such, what kind of reforms we need in spirituality? Do we need any reform in spirituality? Some people talk about the reforms in spiritual guidelines also. So what is your opinion and how we think about these things?
There are two very interesting points you brought. One is the technology side, and particularly with even including AI and computers, and on the other side, the reform in spirituality. So two things you notice, very interesting. The whole of modern technical IT explosion took place in Silicon Valley and largely dominated by Indian immigrants to the United States. I remember 1992, 93, maybe 92, Bill Gates at that time, Microsoft was just coming into its own. It was not as big as it was today. And Bill Gates had just had first exposure to programmers from India. And he came to India, and I remember reading this report. He said, I want to take from India the 50 best programmers because I've not found better programmers from anywhere else in the world. That was the basis of hiring Indian IT professionals in Silicon Valley, which really built the whole revolution of Silicon Valley. And the question you could have asked, why couldn't that take place in India? Well, because India was still under colonization. Not by the British, but by the Indic British. You see, the British spoke of they built an intermediate race that they called coconuts. They were white inside and brown outside. So the thinking was white. Literally, they use that phrase. And so you had these Britishers who were sitting in Indian chairs, who were still using the same domination of the old and the communist socialist framework, suppressing, preventing freedom and growth. And the IT industry therefore took away Indians from India. And those Indians, when they returned and started their own startups and began that, there was a huge boom in India. And then the government created an information technology ministry. At that time it was a different government. And what did they do? The first thing they did was control everything and suppress everything, tax everything. You see, the whole attempt to control, which those people out there without those controls could freely explore. So the necessity for freedom from the colonial mindset and the need for controls, this is a huge shift that's only happened, I will not even say last 10 years, it's happened in the last 6 years, where the government, and led by Narendra Modi, has promoted the startup culture itself, encouraging multiple independent centers. So this is a recent event. So with that, already many things have begun to shift. But on the other side is the equivalent correction needed in the spiritual space, where you have control systems, not by the government, but by the lineages where you have the authority of somebody who holds a staff. I remember Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who recently passed away, had organized a meeting of all the lineages of India, all the major lineages, and he had brought together 108, I believe. And he was sharing his experience, the first time when he brought all of them together. Each one, they were dressed in their traditional attire, and each had a staff. Depending on the lineage, the staff had to be a height of shoulder or head or more than head. And all these authority structures were there. And then he had them all seated. He said it was the most difficult challenge to get them all seated in one hall. Because each one said, I'm superior to that. How dare you put me under him? Okay. So finally he got them all together. They went through their formal sessions. Each one spoke formally. Then he took the initiative. He said, now that we have spoken formally, I will meet you informally. And he went and sat down in the middle of the whole assembly and invited others to sit with him. He broke that formal relationship and brought in a humility which was missing in that space. The problem of many of these religious structures is they've become so ossified, so rigidified, that they've lost their spiritual core and values. and have forgotten to live by them and simply go by the authority structure and the pretenses of it. Sri Aurobindo is brutally frank in this when he uses phrases like, I don't get the exact words, but something where he says the coarse, blind ritualism into which the religions have declined. A huge correction is needed there, and it cannot begin with the authority figures. They are the last to change. It begins with the people. It begins with people recognizing that this is what we want and we do not want to bind ourselves in those limitations. Often that comes by a rejection and then a re-embracement from a freer position. And we're seeing that as part of the struggle, which unfortunately is negatively interpreted as loss of religion, loss of interest in religion, which is certainly one aspect of it.
So one more question with this we'll conclude the session. So Aurobindo talks about divine life, and in Indian philosophy normally we talk about dharma, artha, kama and moksha. Compared to moksha, Aurobindo prefers divine life. So can you explain a little more about what kind of divine life is more relevant to us right now?
Yes. So this is one of the very interesting things. I'm glad you brought this up. A structure organized in the past for optimizing life into its spiritual potential is classified in these 4 steps. So first you're a student, and at that time you're learning and organizing yourself in alignment with the deeper spiritual truth, dharma, and then you move into family life where wealth and management of life circumstances and comfort and enjoyment and pleasure become the artha second mode, and wealth, and then kama, which is much more enjoyment, and then the moksha, which is described as liberation, but which is understood in ascetic terms, is one of the structures of this sequencing. But if you go deeply into it, the 4 are simultaneous. During the artha and kama, you do not abandon dharma, isn't it? You do not forget that moksha is still what is the direction, liberation is still your larger goal. It's only that now we need to reinterpret all 4 and restructure them in a different alignment relevant to the present context. So this would be a very good example of how knowledge from the past, or even a form in which that knowledge was practiced, can be recast without losing the core in a new form. So in such a context, moksha itself we would understand in terms of becoming free of all bindings and limitations. What is moksha finally, isn't it? So moksha is loosely translated today, or is understood in terms of abandoning life and going away into some beyond. But the word moksha is only liberation. Liberation from what? And if you see the nature of that beyond, the divine consciousness is free of all qualification, of all limitation, of all finiteness. And you can attain to the moksha, or the liberation of that consciousness, in life itself. Such is the Vedic ideal, isn't it? So the moksha itself is a principle to be free of all limitation, of all conditioning, of all bindings. And this is what Sri Krishna teaches when he says, abandon all dharmas and take refuge in me, but in the domain of war. So he does not tell Arjuna, abandon everything and take moksha, go out. He says, in the state of liberation, fight as an instrument of the divine. So a return to the principle of the Vedic principle articulated in the Bhagavad Gita itself, to which Sri Aurobindo makes an interesting comment. He says there were 2 mantras given for India's liberation. The first mantra was Vande Mataram, which brought India to a certain freedom, and then we abandoned it immediately, which led to the collapse again. We lost the freedom, you see. The second mantra, he said, very interesting. The second mantra is from the Bhagavad Gita. He says, has yet to liberate humanity. And that mantra is Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja. Abandoning all dharmas, take refuge in me alone. I will deliver thee, the Divine Lord says. So this liberation has to be turned in terms of abandonment of superficial and limiting dharmas to find the deeper dharma of the self and let that lead or organize other dharmas. If we take it in this spirit, then the dharma, artha, kama and moksha can be recast into a life of plenitude, of wealth, of enjoyment. And enjoyment is not unspiritual. It is a part of the spiritual life. on the basis of a deeper spiritual truth. Does that make sense? Wouldn't that be what we should all be striving for? And will it not inevitably give the necessary missing content to the life of the youth? The youth of India today, shorn of the spirituality, are lost. In a crude imitation of Western reductionist materialism, they have also lost their way in the same confusion that you see in the West. And the return to the spirituality should be in such terms, where spirituality brings value and meaning, joy and knowledge and strength and love, all this into life, which will always be growing without limits. So let's hope, let's pray for this. Let's all, I would suggest, for here, because we are here for a work, not just for sharing ideas. We are here for a work. All of us in our own space should seed these ideas actively. Not only with the youth, but also within our own lives, embody these more and more and inspire others. The more you are able to embody, the more your words will carry the force of inspiration. And you must, all of us, must make this effort. And we will be the seeds. As Auroville is the seed for the world, we will be the seeds within Auroville and within the world of our own space for the new spiritual dawn, the new Satya Yuga that is imminent, of which we are in a transitional phase.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to call Jayanti Madam to the stage.
Then nothing really to add, but the last question that was asked, and what, it was a beautiful summing up. The life divine, I was reading the origin of it. How did the work Life Divine come about? And it was also in some ways a continuation of the line of thought that Sri Aurobindo wrote when he was originally started with translating Isha Upanishad. And just to put it in context here, because he talks of the confusion that a lot of young people have, and a lot of us go through these questions, because a lot of our growing up years, somewhere the medium that we all grew up in talked about abandoning the pleasures of the world, and that was slightly given a lower place of prominence as compared to the journey within. And that's something which is there across many religions, the Christian religion too. It's more about a Spartan living, and that's universally, it was there. That was the context to language. And when I used to read these two lines in the Isha Upanishad, it spoke of something that is referred to as Vidya. Vidya is the equivalent of the journey within, and Avidya, which is not something bad, but as we say, we've colored it. Avidya referred to all that you needed to survive, in the sense food, plenty, prosperity, progress, all that we spoke about, which is needed on this plane. And it said something which, as a young person, got me a little foxed. It said, those that follow the path of avidya fall into a deep, dark hole. It made sense, because you'd somewhere been conditioned to believe that if you just follow the path of, making wealth alone, unbridled success, fame, beauty, aesthetics, enjoyment, you fall into a dark, deep hole, a metaphor of saying that that's not really sustainable. And the next sentence said, but those that follow the path of Vidya, which is the journey within, fall into a deeper, darker hole. So this got me a little flummoxed as a child. So going in, just in, is that again, so what does it mean? And it's much later when one read Sri Aurobindo, and that's where this importance of synthesis, and that's exactly what came here, the life divine. So it's not about exclusively being on this journey within, which is the damage that also happened. We got, in a way, we lost all our vitality, all as a race, our ability to think, all of it, and which is what made us a little vulnerable for attacks and so on. But it's also not about just, going unconsciously towards money at any cost, as they say, but having that beautiful sweet spot, if we can use that synthesis of embracing life, but embracing it with consciousness, and which is what our traditions, and that's what in a way Sri Aurobindo, even the secret of the Vedas, life divine, all these, basically this is what it is. And so I think this is a beautiful question culminating, and I think the entire talk was beautiful. And again, I would urge that given all that you both brought, Sarraju ji, as you all know, is a member of the governing board, and I think also in his own right a great scholar, and he's been very, very supportive of all these initiatives that have been happening. He's been driving a lot of it over the last 4 years. And I think as a beautiful culmination, because we discussed it earlier also, as Balindu Bhai was suggesting, we must have something like an Auroville declaration at the end of the Global Spirituality Mahotsav. So if these things can also be brought into some guiding principles, of course, all within the ambit of the Charter, which is so embracing of just about everything, every dimension of life, but also with specific action points from where we are. It's like the stalactites and stalagmites. From where we are, what is it that we can do? Because we have to in some way be the torchbearers of that change. Auroville was meant to do that. So I think I would really like to see some of these ideas also getting crystallized. It was absolutely a delight. And of course, Sraddhalu ji, I mean, for many years, I think the first time I heard him was on a recorded speech way back, I think in the year 2001 or 2. And at that time, it was about Nostradamus and all of that, you know. But over the years, the kind of maturity in thought, action, words, and the kind of work that is happening, it's beautiful that all this is coalescing instead of all of this being again competing worlds. But I think the synthesis is happening, and I want to really acknowledge the wonderful discussion in enriching and uplifting discussions that we had. But we do hope we also get something concrete which can take us forward. Thank you so much to Sarraju ji and Shraddhalu ji. Thank you.